Corgis, the dog breed she's famously fond of.
There are a number of fights
Between
the dogs.
let alone between the family, but between the dogs.
Between the dogs.
Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 years caring for her dogs with a devotion that the whole world admired, and her final wish was simple: keep them safe. But within 1 year of her death, one dog was dead and another had vanished from public view entirely. What really happened inside those palace walls? And did the people she trusted most let her down? Join us as we find out. The mystery. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in September of 2022, the world grieved the loss of one of the most iconic figures in modern history. With flags lowered, crowds gathered outside the palace gates, and tributes pouring in from every corner of the globe. But quietly, away from the cameras and the headlines, a smaller story was unfolding, one that almost nobody noticed. The Queen's beloved Corgis needed a home. The palace moved quickly, and within days, an official announcement confirmed that the dogs had been safely rehomed with trusted people who would care for them. The public exhaled, and it seemed like a warm ending to a beloved chapter. 2 loyal dogs placed in good hands, living out their days in comfort and peace. But something did not add up. Within months, the photos stopped, the updates disappeared, and social media accounts that had shared cheerful images of the dogs playing in lush gardens suddenly went quiet. Then came news that one of the dogs had died, young, suddenly, and without any real explanation, while the other was quietly moved to a completely different location, with barely a word from the palace. No answers, no transparency, just silence. For millions of people around the world who had grown up watching the Queen walk her dogs across the grounds of Windsor, that silence felt deeply wrong, and the questions it left behind refused to go away. So, what actually happened to the Queen's Corgis? To understand that, we first need to understand just how deeply these dogs were woven into the Queen's life, and why they meant so much more than the world ever realized. Why the dogs mattered so much. To understand why the world cared so deeply about what happened to the Queen's Corgis, you first need to go back to the year 1944, to a young princess who had just turned 18, and to a small, golden dog named Susan. Susan was a Pembroke Welsh Corgi, compact and sturdy, with a fox-like face and ears that stood straight up like tiny antennae, and from the moment she arrived as a birthday gift, something clicked between her and the young princess in a way that would shape the next 7 decades of royal life. The Queen did not simply love Susan the way most people love a pet. She loved her the way you love a constant companion, someone who is always there, always loyal, always present regardless of what is happening in the world around you. And the world around the Queen was often complicated, demanding, and isolating in ways that most people will never fully understand. So Susan became something steady in all of that noise. What happened next is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in royal history, because Susan did not just become the Queen's favorite dog, she became the foundation of an entire bloodline. And over the following 70 years, the Queen would own more than 30 Corgis, nearly every single one of them a direct descendant of that one birthday gift from 1944, a living, breathing family tree that grew alongside the Queen herself. These were not dogs that lived in kennels or were handed off to staff at the end of the day. They were woven into the fabric of daily royal life in a way that was genuinely unusual for someone of the Queen's position and responsibility. She personally prepared their meals, mixing portions with care and attention that surprised even the household staff around her. She walked them through the gardens of her various residences, and she kept them close during working hours, so that the quiet presence of a Corgi padding across a carpet or curling up near a chair became one of the most recognizable images of her reign. There is a famous story, repeated often by people who worked inside the palace, that the Corgis were among the very few living things that could interrupt a royal audience without consequence, wandering into meetings, nudging hands, demanding attention in the middle of conversations with prime ministers and world leaders, and the Queen would simply smile. That image tells you everything you need to know about what these animals meant to her. They were not symbols, they were not props, they were not part of the royal brand in the way that palaces and portraits and carriages are. They were simply her dogs, the ones she fed and walked and worried over, the ones that were always happy to see her regardless of what the newspapers were saying that morning. which makes what happened after her death all the more difficult to understand, because the arrangements that followed looked nothing like the life she had so carefully built for them. The Queen's final arrangements. As the Queen's health began to visibly decline in the final years of her reign, those closest to her noticed that she was thinking carefully about what would happen after she was gone, not just to the monarchy, not just to her family, but to her dogs. According to people with knowledge of the royal household, the Queen was specific and deliberate about her wishes. She wanted the Corgis placed with individuals who genuinely loved animals, people who understood their routines, their temperaments, their needs, and who would care for them the way she had, quietly and consistently, without fuss or fanfare. She reportedly did not want the dogs to become part of the public grieving process, turned into symbols of her legacy, or photographed endlessly for newspapers. Hungry for something tender and relatable in the immediate aftermath of her death, she simply wanted them to be happy, and she trusted that the right people, given the chance, would make that possible. Two of those dogs were Muick and Sandy, a pair of Pembroke Welsh Corgis that had come into her life during the difficult years of the pandemic, gifted to her by her son Prince Andrew and his daughter Princess Beatrice. And they had quickly become a source of quiet joy during a period when the Queen was largely isolated from the wider world, walking the same garden paths each day with fewer visitors and a much smaller household around her. When the palace made its announcement in the days following her death in September of 2022, the public learned that Muick and Sandy had been placed with Prince Andrew and his former wife Sarah Ferguson, who lived together at Royal Lodge in Windsor, a sprawling estate that Andrew had occupied for years. On the surface, the decision seemed reasonable. Andrew had been involved in gifting one of the dogs originally, and Sarah Ferguson had a well-documented love of animals, often speaking about her pets with genuine warmth in interviews and on social media. So the early photographs that emerged, showing the Corgis bounding across the gardens of Royal Lodge, seemed to confirm that everything was fine. But two other dogs told a quietly different story, because Candy, a Corgi Dachshund mix, and Lissy, a Cocker Spaniel, had not gone to family members at all. They had been placed with long-serving members of the palace staff, people who had spent years caring for the Queen's animals alongside her, learning their habits and earning their trust in the patient, unglamorous way that genuine animal care requires. Nobody made a big announcement about Candy and Lissy. There were no photographs released to the press, no statements from the palace about their new homes. They simply disappeared from public view in the quietest and most unremarkable way possible. And while Muick and Sandy were being photographed at Royal Lodge, those two quieter dogs were already thriving in a way that would only become significant much later, when the full picture of what happened began to emerge. The silence that raised questions. For the first few months after the Queen's death, the arrangement at Royal Lodge appeared to be working, and Sarah Ferguson in particular seemed to embrace her role as the Corgis' new caretaker with genuine enthusiasm, posting occasional updates on social media that showed the dogs settling into their new surroundings, playing in the gardens, curling up indoors, living what looked from the outside like a perfectly comfortable life. Royal Watchers, the devoted community of people who follow the British monarchy with extraordinary attention to detail, noted the updates warmly and moved on, reassured that the Queen's beloved companions were being well looked after by people who clearly cared about them. Then the updates stopped. It did not happen dramatically or all at once. It happened the way most unsettling things happen, gradually, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, until one day someone noticed that weeks had passed without a single photograph, and then months. And the accounts that had previously shared those cheerful garden images had gone completely silent on the subject of the Corgis, as though the dogs had simply ceased to exist. In the world of royal watching, silence from the palace is rarely accidental, and the community that tracks these details began asking questions that the palace showed no interest in answering, because the timing of the silence coincided with a period of significant turbulence in the lives of the people who were supposed to be caring for the dogs. Prince Andrew, already a deeply controversial figure following years of damaging headlines and a highly publicized legal settlement, was facing fresh pressure from King Charles III, who had reportedly made clear that Andrew's continued occupation of Royal Lodge, a large and valuable royal estate, was a matter he intended to revisit, and the dispute between the two brothers over the property had begun to attract its own separate stream of media attention. Royal Lodge was no longer a peaceful country home. It had become the backdrop for a very public family conflict, with reports of tension, financial strain, and uncertainty about the future swirling around it on an almost weekly basis. And somewhere in the middle of all of that were two small dogs that had spent their entire lives in the carefully managed calm of the Queen's household. The contrast could not have been sharper, and for people who understood what the Queen's environment had looked like, what kind of consistency and routine she had built for her animals over decades, the idea of those same animals now living inside an ongoing royal dispute felt deeply uncomfortable. But nobody from the palace addressed it publicly, and the silence continued to build, until it was finally broken in the worst possible way, by news that one of the dogs was gone, not relocated, not rehomed, but dead, at an age when a healthy Corgi should have had the best years of its life still ahead of it. The royal family conflict. To fully understand what was happening to the Corgis at Royal Lodge, you need to understand the environment they had been placed into, because by the time the silence around them became noticeable, that environment had become one of the most unstable in the entire royal family. Prince Andrew had spent years quietly retreating from public life, following a series of damaging controversies that had fundamentally altered his standing within the institution he had served for decades. And while the details of those controversies had been widely reported, the practical reality of his daily existence at Royal Lodge was less understood by the general public. A man of considerable former status, now living in a kind of uncomfortable limbo, stripped of his military titles and royal duties, but still occupying one of the most valuable properties in the royal estate. King Charles, newly crowned and reportedly determined to modernize and streamline the monarchy in ways his mother had never fully pursued, had made it known through various channels that Andrew's continued residence at Royal Lodge was something he intended to challenge. And the dispute between the two brothers became one of the most persistent background stories of the early years of the new reign, never fully resolved, never fully quieted, simply simmering at a low heat beneath the surface of official royal business. For Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, who had rebuilt a version of domestic life together at Royal Lodge despite having divorced decades earlier, the pressure was significant. Financial difficulties had been reported around the property's maintenance costs, which were considerable for an estate of that size, and the uncertainty about the future of their tenure created a household atmosphere that was, by most accounts, far removed from the stable and structured environment the Queen had maintained for her animals throughout her life. Sarah Ferguson, to her credit, had spoken openly and warmly about the Corgis in the early months, and those who knew her well described a genuine affection for the animals that was not simply performance for the cameras, but genuine affection and disrupted routine are two very different things. And the Corgis had been raised in one of the most routined households in Britain, where meal times, walk times, and rest times had been observed with the kind of consistency that most families reserve for their children. That consistency was now absent, replaced by uncertainty, media attention, legal pressures, and the low-grade anxiety of a household that did not know what the coming months would bring. Royal insiders who spoke to journalists during this period were careful with their words, but the picture that emerged between the lines was one of two small animals, caught in circumstances they had no way of understanding, removed from everything familiar, and placed into something that must have felt, to them, entirely foreign. The Queen had spent 70 years building a world for her dogs, and within 12 months of her death, that world had been replaced by something unrecognizable, and the consequences of that replacement were about to become impossible to ignore. The death of Sandy. In October of 2023, just over a year after the Queen's death, Sarah Ferguson posted a short message on social media that stopped royal watchers mid-scroll, because the news it carried was not the kind anyone had been expecting, and the questions it immediately raised were not the kind the palace was prepared to answer. Sandy was dead. The announcement was brief and emotional in tone, expressing grief and gratitude for the time they had shared with the dog, and in isolation, it read as the kind of heartfelt farewell that any devoted pet owner might post. Sincere and sad, and entirely unremarkable, except that Sandy was approximately 5 years old. Pembroke Welsh Corgis are a hardy and generally healthy breed, with a typical lifespan of between 12 and 15 years, meaning that a Corgi of 5 years old is not in the twilight of its life, but squarely in the middle of it, energetic and physically capable, and nowhere near the age at which natural decline typically begins. And so the announcement, however heartfelt, immediately prompted a very obvious question that Sarah Ferguson's post did not come close to answering. What had happened? No illness was mentioned, no accident, no underlying condition, no visit to a veterinarian that had revealed something unexpected, just a short message, a few photographs, and then silence again, the same silence that had surrounded the dogs for months before this moment arrived. The palace issued no statement, King Charles's office said nothing, and the wider royal communications apparatus, which is extraordinarily well practiced at managing narratives around sensitive subjects, simply allowed the question to hang in the air unanswered, which for many people was itself a kind of answer, or at least a signal that the full story was not going to be shared voluntarily. Royal watchers and animal welfare advocates reacted with a mixture of grief and unease, because the combination of factors surrounding Sandy's death, the young age, the absence of explanation, the months of prior silence, the unstable household environment, painted a picture that was difficult to interpret charitably, and the conversation that spread across online communities in the days following the announcement was pointed and uncomfortable. Some defended the arrangement entirely, arguing that animals die unexpectedly and that grief needs no justification or explanation, while others raised more direct concerns about whether the placement had been appropriate at all, whether the environment at Royal Lodge had provided what the dogs genuinely needed, and whether the Queen's actual wishes had been followed or quietly set aside in favor of an arrangement that served other purposes. The quiet relocation. With Sandy gone and questions circulating that showed no sign of fading quietly, attention turned almost entirely to Muick, the sole surviving Corgi from the Queen's final years. And what happened next suggested that someone inside the royal household had been paying very close attention to everything that had unfolded over the previous 12 months. In early 2024, reports began to surface through royal correspondence and palace-adjacent sources that Muick had been moved, not dramatically, not with any formal announcement or press release, but quietly and efficiently in the way that institutions move things when they want the action noted but not examined too closely. Muick was now living at Windsor Castle, under the direct care of royal household staff, the same network of experienced and devoted employees who had spent years working alongside the Queen, learning her routines and the rhythms of her animals, and who understood instinctively what a Corgi raised in that particular environment needed in order to feel settled and secure. The official explanation, offered to journalists who pressed for comment, was brief and deliberately uncomplicated, essentially communicating that the current arrangement was simply better suited to the dog's needs, that Windsor Castle provided continuity and familiarity, and that the decision had been made with Muick's welfare as the primary consideration. It was a careful statement, and a revealing one, because embedded within it was an implicit acknowledgement that the previous arrangement had not, in fact, been optimal, that something about the situation at Royal Lodge had fallen short of what a dog of Muick's background and temperament required, and that a correction had been necessary. The palace did not frame it that way explicitly. Institutions rarely do, but the logic was inescapable for anyone willing to follow it to its conclusion, and royal watchers who had been raising concerns for months found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having been, in the most important sense, right. What made the relocation particularly significant was not just where Muick had been moved to, but what that destination represented, because Windsor Castle was not simply a royal residence. It was the place where the Queen had spent the most meaningful and consistent portions of her later life, where the staff knew the Corgis by name and temperament, where the gardens and walkways were familiar, and where the entire infrastructure of care that the Queen had built over decades was still, essentially, intact. Moving Muick, there was not just a logistical decision, it was a correction, a quiet admission that the original placement had placed other considerations above the dog's actual welfare, and that those responsible for his care had ultimately decided that could not continue. It was the right outcome, but it arrived after Sandy was already gone, and after more than a year of silence that had left millions of people who loved the Queen's dogs without the transparency they deserved, raising a question that the relocation alone could not answer. The dogs who thrived. While the story of Muick and Sandy was unfolding in full public view, with its silences and its questions and its quiet corrective ending, two other dogs were living very different lives entirely, and their story had gone almost completely unnoticed, tucked away from the headlines in the kind of ordinary, undramatic happiness that rarely attracts attention precisely because nothing is going wrong. Candy and Lissy, the Corgi Dachshund mix, and the Cocker Spaniel, who had also been part of the Queen's household in her final years, had been placed not with members of the royal family but with long-serving members of the palace staff. People who had worked closely with the Queen for years and who had been present for the daily routines that shaped the lives of her animals, the feeding schedules, the walking routes, the particular ways the dogs liked to be handled and settled and reassured. These were not high-profile placements. There were no press releases, no photographs distributed to news agencies, no social media updates charting their progress in their new homes. Just two animals quietly transferred into the care of people who already knew them, already loved them, and already understood what they needed, and then left alone to simply get on with the business of being happy. The results were striking in their clarity. Candy, despite being a mixed breed with no particular claim to longevity based on her size alone, lived to the remarkable age of 18. A lifespan that places her well beyond the average for either of the breeds in her background, and one that speaks to the quality of care she received throughout her life in that new home, consistent, attentive, and built entirely around her needs rather than anyone else's. Lissy, the Cocker Spaniel, was by multiple reports still alive and healthy at the time this story was being examined, comfortable and settled in a home that had asked nothing of her except to be a dog, cared for by someone whose primary motivation was simply her well-being. The contrast between these two outcomes and the outcome at Royal Lodge was not subtle, and it was not the kind of contrast that could be explained away by breed differences or random misfortune. It was the kind of contrast that pointed clearly and directly at the single most important variable in the equation, which was not the size of the estate, or the wealth of the caretaker, or the proximity to royal life, but simply whether the person responsible for the animal had the time, the stability, and the genuine undivided attention that a dog raised in the Queen's household required. Staff who had spent years in that world had all three of those things, and the dogs in their care reflected it in the most straightforward way possible, by living long, healthy, and contented lives entirely out of the public eye, which was, it is worth remembering, exactly what the Queen had wanted for all of them, the Queen's real wishes. By the time the full picture had come into focus, with Sandy gone, Muick relocated, and Candy and Lissy living quietly and well in homes built around their needs, a deeper and more uncomfortable question had begun to take shape beneath the surface of all the individual details, and it was a question that pointed not at the dogs themselves, but at the decision made in the immediate aftermath of the Queen's death, and whether that decision had genuinely reflected what she had wanted. According to sources with knowledge of the royal household, the Queen's wishes regarding her dogs had been clear and specific. She wanted them placed with people whose primary qualification was that they truly loved animals and understood the particular routines and sensitivities of dogs that had been raised in her environment. And she had been explicit that she did not want them used as props in the management of anyone's public image, however well-intentioned that management might appear from the outside. Those wishes, as they were described by people close to the household, pointed unmistakably in one direction, toward the kind of placement that Candy and Lissy ultimately received: quiet, private, built entirely around the dogs rather than around the people caring for them, and entirely removed from the pressures and visibility of royal family life. The placement of Muick and Sandy at Royal Lodge pointed in a different direction entirely, and the reasons for that decision, though never officially explained, were not difficult to piece together from the broader context of what was happening inside the royal family at the time. Because placing the Queen's beloved Corgis with a controversial and beleaguered family member served a purpose that had nothing to do with the dogs, offering a moment of warmth and continuity at a time when Prince Andrew's public standing was in serious need of both. The dogs, in other words, may have been used to soften an image, to provide a connection to the beloved late Queen at a moment when that connection carried enormous sentimental value, and to create a narrative of normalcy and love around a household that was, in reality, anything but normal. This is not a comfortable conclusion to arrive at, and it is worth acknowledging that it cannot be stated as established fact, because the internal conversations that led to the placement decision have never been made public, and it is entirely possible that those involved believed genuinely that they were acting in the dog's best interests, even as they were also serving other purposes simultaneously. But the evidence available, the early death, the prolonged silence, the eventual relocation, the stark contrast with the dogs placed in staff homes, All of it pointed toward a single, quiet truth: that somewhere between the Queen's carefully expressed wishes and the palace's public announcement, something had been lost, and two small animals had paid the price for it, while the institution responsible looked the other way and said nothing. The unanswered question. Today, Muick lives quietly at Windsor Castle, back inside the world the Queen built for him, walked by staff who knew him before she was gone, settled into routines that finally feel familiar again, and by all accounts, comfortable in a way that the years at Royal Lodge never quite managed to provide. It is, in its own small way, a happy ending, but it is an incomplete one, because the questions that surround how he got there have never been answered. And the people responsible for the decisions that led to Sandy's death and Muick's difficult years have never been asked to account for any of it publicly. Sandy was 5 years old, a corgi in the prime of its life, raised in one of the most carefully managed animal environments in Britain, and she died without explanation in a household defined by instability and public scandal, while the palace said nothing. That silence was a choice, and choices like that have consequences, not just for two small dogs, but for the millions of people who trusted that the Queen's final wishes would be honored. Sometimes the smallest stories carry the heaviest weight, because they reveal what an institution does when nobody is watching closely enough, when the stakes feel too low to demand accountability, and when the truth is less convenient than the silence. The Queen loved her dogs simply and completely. She asked only that others do the same, and that request, more than anything else in this situation, deserved better.